He was born in the final years of the 19th century, in a land where ideas of nationalism and imperial nostalgia seemed to float permanently in the air. Pietro Caruso did not begin life destined for infamy or historical condemnation. Like many young Italians of his generation, he grew up in the shadow of a fragmented national identity and the promise that a strong hand, any strong hand, might restore order, pride, and a sense of direction. His early years were marked less by political conviction and more by circumstance, the chaos of post-World War I Italy, the rise of charismatic authoritarianism, and the seductive pull of a movement that promised greatness through discipline and obedience. In that atmosphere, Caruso found his way into the ranks of the fascist police apparatus almost naturally, as if drifting along a river whose current kept strengthening. He began as a minor functionary, a man of middling ambition but notable loyalty, someone who followed orders with meticulous attention and little question. Superiors like that, especially in the formative years of the fascist regime, when Mussolini needed men who did not hesitate. Caruso, sensing opportunity, leaned deeper into this role. Over the years, his obedience turned into a kind of ideological rigidity. It was difficult to say whether he truly believed in the doctrines he enforced, or whether belief slowly emerged because he had invested so many years serving them. By the 1930s, he stood firmly within the structure of fascist policing, and his reputation was one of efficiency and unyielding loyalty. The world around him, however, was changing. Italian fascism, increasingly entangled in its alliance with Nazi Germany, drifted from authoritarian nationalism into a darker, more violent machinery of repression. Caruso adapted. Perhaps he adapted too well. When the Second World War began, Caruso found himself positioned advantageously within the Ministry of Interior. His ability to enforce order, to coordinate the police infrastructure, and to execute directives without hesitation made him a valuable asset. Yet the collapse of Mussolini's rule in 1943, the German occupation of Rome, and the rise of the Italian Social Republic forced him to confront a new landscape, one in which survival depended not only on loyalty but on proximity to power. He aligned himself with the puppet fascist regime reinstated in the north and placed himself under the influence of the German security apparatus. In the shifting chaos of occupied Italy, men like Caruso gained more authority precisely because the old structures had disintegrated. Rome, especially, became a fractured city where allegiances shifted under the pressure of fear, resistance, sabotage, and the relentless presence of the Gestapo. The Germans needed Italian collaborators who understood the local population. Caruso, with years of experience, became essential. In September 1943, after the fall of Rome to German control, he was appointed the chief of police for the capital. This gave him a position of immense power, although always under the shadow of German command. The collaboration was not one of equals, it was one of necessity and subordination. He was expected to maintain order, suppress resistance, and assist in identifying Jews, partisans, and political opponents. It was a role that demanded severity, and Caruso embraced it with a zeal that would ultimately destroy him. By 1944, the resistance in Rome had grown increasingly bold. Sabotage operations, the dissemination of underground newspapers, and guerrilla actions had become frequent. The Germans responded with escalating brutality, and they expected their Italian counterparts to do the same. Caruso worked hand in hand with Herbert Kappler, the German SS officer who supervised Rome's security. Their collaboration was not just administrative, it was intimate, direct, and increasingly violent. Files were exchanged, lists were compiled, interrogations conducted with ruthless efficiency. Fear became a currency, and the police headquarters transformed into a place where names entered quietly but often did not emerge again. Caruso's role in this machinery was not peripheral. He was fully involved, not only as an executor of orders but as an architect of repression within Rome. His relationship with Kappler, however, cemented his fate. When the event that would define both their destinies occurred, Caruso's name became indelibly linked to one of the darkest episodes in Italian wartime history. On March 23, 1944, members of the GAP, an armed resistance group, carried out a bombing attack against a column of German soldiers belonging to the SS Police Regiment Bozen. The explosion on Via Rasella killed 33 German troops. The attack shook the occupying forces and provoked immediate fury. Hitler himself ordered a ruthless reprisal, 10 Italians executed for every German killed. The German authorities demanded the assistance of their Italian collaborators in identifying and assembling the victims. Kappler organized the list with chilling efficiency, and Pietro Caruso assisted him. He provided names of prisoners, political detainees, Jews already arrested, and individuals under police surveillance. The selection was arbitrary in many cases, driven not by individual guilt but by quotas determined by the mathematics of vengeance. In total, 335 people were massacred inside the Fosse Ardeatine caves. The killings were carried out systematically, victims shot in the neck, bodies stacked and sealed inside the cavern with explosives. Caruso was not physically present at the site of the execution, but his administrative role, his contribution to the list, and his logistical assistance rendered him undeniably complicit. For decades after the war, historians would debate the exact extent of his initiative, but no one doubted that he had willingly cooperated. The massacre marked a point of no return, not only for Italy under occupation but for Caruso himself. Whatever illusions he may have harbored about loyalty, duty, or the justification of authoritarian order evaporated in the face of what had been done. When Rome was liberated by the Allies in June 1944, Pietro Caruso attempted to flee. He had spent the final days of German occupation burning documents, erasing evidence, and trying to conceal his role. But the fall of regimes rarely leaves room for escape. Caruso was captured on June 22, still wearing parts of his uniform, his face bearing the exhaustion of a man who understood precisely what awaited him. The mood in liberated Rome was not one of calm reflection. The city had endured occupation, hunger, arrests, and the terror of the Fosse Ardeatine massacre. The people were frightened, angry, and desperate for justice. Figures like Caruso, whose names had become symbols of collaboration and cruelty, were not merely criminals in the eyes of the public, they were embodiments of the suffering Rome had endured. His arrest was an event marked by raw emotion. Crowds gathered, shouted insults, spat at him, and demanded immediate punishment. He was taken to the Regina Coeli prison, the very place where he had overseen the detention of countless victims. Poetic justice, some said. Others felt that justice could never balance the scale. Inside the prison, Caruso's demeanor changed. He no longer carried the arrogance of authority. He became withdrawn, silent, almost resigned. The man who had enforced order now found himself among men whose lives he had shattered. Some recognized him immediately. Others stared at him with a hatred that required no introduction. The officials in charge attempted to maintain control, but the tension was palpable. Caruso's future would not be determined in quiet deliberation, it would unfold rapidly under the weight of public grief and rage. His trial was convened before the newly established Italian High Court for sanctions against fascism. The proceedings were swift, intense, and widely publicized. There was no need for lengthy investigations. His collaboration with the Germans, his role in the repression of Rome, and his participation in the Fosse Ardeatine massacre were well documented. Witnesses testified, survivors recounted, and prosecutors laid out the evidence with methodical precision. Caruso attempted to defend himself by claiming subordination, insisting that he had acted under German command and had no authority to resist. But the argument was hollow. The court knew, and the public knew, that while Germany had ordered the reprisal, Caruso had actively facilitated it. He had provided names, he had selected prisoners, and he had ensured the logistics ran smoothly. His cooperation had exceeded what mere obedience required. As the trial progressed, it became clear that Caruso struggled not only with the charges but with the overwhelming tide of testimony detailing the brutality of the occupation. He listened as witnesses described torture, extortion, blackmail, and arbitrary arrests. Much of this had flowed directly through his office. The trial lasted only a few days, but for Caruso, it likely felt like an eternity. His face, once stern and rigid, softened into something more fragile, more exposed. The weight of inevitability pressed on him. When the verdict was delivered, death by firing squad, Caruso reportedly closed his eyes briefly, as if acknowledging an outcome he had foreseen since the day Rome was liberated. His execution would be public, the court ruled. The people of Rome, who had suffered under his authority, would witness the conclusion of the man who had served the occupiers with such zeal. The sentence was scheduled without delay. In the days following the sentencing, Pietro Caruso entered a state of suspended existence. Every sound in the prison corridor, every metallic clang of a door, every echoing footstep felt like a reminder of the swift end approaching him. Execution sentences during that turbulent period in Italy were carried out without lengthy appeals, without the possibility of international intervention, and without the bureaucratic delays typical of peacetime justice systems. The country was still fighting a war on its own soil, chaos was widespread, and justice, imperfect but urgent, was demanded by a suffering population. Rome, newly liberated but still reeling from the German occupation, carried wounds that had not even begun to heal. In that atmosphere, Caruso's presence was almost unbearable for many. He symbolized betrayal, cruelty, complicity, and submission to a foreign power that had disfigured the city's soul. Caruso's interactions in prison were minimal. Guards described him as strangely calm, neither defiant nor hysterical. He spoke little, and when he did, it was mostly to ask procedural questions, when he would be allowed to see a priest, when he would be given paper to write, when he would be informed of the exact hour of execution. He did not ask for clemency, he seemed to understand that none would be granted. Those who observed him noted a peculiar resignation, as if the man who had once wielded fear as a tool of governance had finally recognized the futility of escaping accountability. Some speculated that he had been shocked into submission by the rapid unraveling of his authority. Others believed he had always been a man who followed the dominant force, and now that the fascist regime had collapsed, he did not know how to assert himself. But there were also whispers, guards speaking quietly among themselves, that Caruso felt something else, fear. Genuine, paralyzing fear. Not the fear of battle or political upheaval, but the fear of facing what he had inflicted on others. In the days leading up to his execution, Caruso received a visit from a priest, an elderly man who had tended to the condemned before. They spoke behind closed doors, and no one knows the details of their conversation. The priest emerged looking pale and somber, but unwilling to reveal anything. Caruso, however, appeared more reflective afterward, as if unburdened by confession or shaken by the reminder of his impending judgment beyond the earthly one. He requested paper and ink and began to write letters, one addressed to his family, another to the authorities who would oversee his execution, and a third whose recipient remains unknown. None of these letters survived, or if they did, they were never made public. Rumors suggest that Caruso attempted to justify his actions, insisting he had obeyed the chain of command. Others believe he sought forgiveness, acknowledging the bloodshed linked to his name. The truth, buried in lost or destroyed documents, can only be imagined. Outside the prison walls, the mood in Rome was charged. News of Caruso's conviction spread quickly, fueling a mixture of relief, anger, and impatience. Survivors of the Fosse Ardeatine massacre, or rather their grieving relatives, because no direct victims remained alive, demanded that justice be seen, not hidden behind stone walls. Members of the Italian resistance, who had fought in the shadows of the occupation, saw Caruso's execution as a symbolic act reaffirming that fascist collaborators would no longer enjoy impunity. Ordinary citizens, who had lived through hunger, bombings, and terror, felt that Caruso represented the cruelty of a system that had betrayed them. In their eyes, his death would not erase the suffering, but it would affirm that the state, now returning to democratic principles, was willing to punish those who had violated the Italian people. The authorities, aware of this emotional and political tension, made the unusual decision to carry out the execution publicly. This was not done out of vengeance but rather as an acknowledgement of the catharsis the moment would provide. They selected a location near Forte Brevetta, a military site west of Rome historically used for executions. It was symbolic, not far from the sites of occupation-era atrocities, and accessible enough for a controlled yet visible event. Security forces prepared the area, ensuring that crowds would be kept at a safe distance, though not so far that the event would become invisible. On the morning of the execution, the atmosphere crackled with anticipation and grief. Families of victims arrived early, many clutching photographs of sons, husbands, or fathers lost in the massacre. Some wept quietly, others stared forward with grim determination, waiting for the justice that had eluded them for so long. The night before his execution, Caruso reportedly did not sleep. Guards said he remained seated on his cot, staring at the wall, occasionally raising his hands to his face as if trying to wipe away thoughts. At times he pressed his palms together tightly, clasping them against his knees in a posture of someone pleading silently with himself or with a God he was no longer certain would listen. The priest visited again, offering prayer and comfort, but Caruso's expression remained frozen in a mixture of dread and acceptance. As dawn approached, the sounds of the awakening prison echoed faintly, distant footsteps, whispered voices, the shuffling of keys, and Caruso stood up slowly, as if each movement was a negotiation with his own limbs. When the guards arrived to escort him, he nodded once, saying nothing. He was dressed in a simple uniform, not the ornate attire of authority he had once worn. His hands were tied, though loosely, more as a formality than a precaution. Caruso did not resist. As he was led through the corridors, some prisoners shouted insults, others spit toward the ground, but most simply watched in silence, witnessing the fall of a man who had controlled their fate with cold indifference. Reaching the prison courtyard, Caruso was placed into a military truck that would transport him to Forte Bravetta. The ride was short but heavy with symbolism. Rome passed by slowly, streets still scarred by war, buildings pockmarked with bullet holes, citizens moving cautiously as they rebuilt their lives. The city itself seemed to look back at Caruso, as if bearing witness to the man who had served those who oppressed it. As the truck neared its destination, the sounds of a gathered crowd reached Caruso even before he could see them. Hundreds had assembled, though kept back by military police. Many carried banners demanding justice, others stood with rigid posture, silent and resolute. Caruso was escorted from the vehicle, his legs unsteady. For a moment, he hesitated, not from resistance but from the sheer weight of the moment. He scanned the distant faces, perhaps searching for someone familiar or perhaps hoping not to recognize anyone at all. It was said that when he saw a group of women holding photographs of their murdered relatives from the Ardeatine caves, he lowered his eyes abruptly, unable to face their grief. He was brought to the execution post, a wooden stake driven firmly into the ground. The soldiers of the firing squad, members of Italy's newly reorganized military, stood nearby, waiting for the order. Their expressions were solemn. They were not men executing an enemy combatant but men enforcing a judgment against one of their own countrymen. Caruso was asked if he wished to be blindfolded. After a moment of hesitation, he declined. Witnesses later said that his face was pale, his jaw trembling slightly, but his eyes remained open and fixed ahead. Perhaps in that moment he sought dignity, or perhaps he believed that whatever awaited him after the final shot required him to face his earthly punishment without hiding. A final statement was offered to him, an opportunity to speak his last words. The crowd quieted. Some expected excuses, others anticipated pleas for mercy. Caruso spoke softly, so softly that only those nearest could hear. Accounts differ. Some said he muttered something about following orders, the same defense he had offered in court. Others claimed he asked forgiveness. A few insisted he said nothing intelligible, only a faint murmur carried away by the wind. What is certain is that his final words did not sway those who heard them. The time for judgment had arrived. The priest stepped beside him, offering him a crucifix, and Caruso kissed it with trembling lips. The soldiers took their positions. The officer in command raised his arm. The air seemed to hold its breath. When the command was given, the rifles fired in unison, their sharp crack echoing across the field and into the hearts of the watching crowd. Caruso's body slumped forward, held momentarily by the ropes binding him to the stake. A second volley was not needed. A doctor approached, confirmed death, and the execution was declared complete. Some spectators wept, others stood in silence. A few shouted words of bitterness, but most simply absorbed the enormity of the moment. Justice, however imperfect, had been delivered. Caruso's body was removed quickly and without ceremony. The authorities wished to avoid any opportunity for political spectacle or martyrdom, though there was little risk of that. His name, now bound to atrocity, carried no dignity in death. He was buried in an unmarked grave, a final gesture of erasure for a man whose legacy would be forever defined by betrayal and violence. In the days that followed, newspapers throughout Italy published long articles recounting his crimes, his trial, and his execution. Historians began to dissect the events leading up to the Fosse Ardeatine massacre, scrutinizing every decision made by Caruso and Kapler. For the families of victims, the execution did not heal their loss, but it provided a moment of closure in a world still shattered by war. In the weeks that followed the execution of Pietro Caruso, Rome tried to regain a sense of equilibrium. The war continued elsewhere in Italy, and the city, though liberated, remained wounded in ways both visible and invisible. Buildings could be repaired, streets could be cleared, and supply lines could be restored, but trust took longer to rebuild. The memories of occupation, betrayal, and collaboration lingered in the minds of citizens who had lived with fear as a constant companion. Caruso's death did not erase what had happened, but it signaled the beginning of a reckoning. It forced the city to confront the reality that many of its own people, not just foreign occupiers, had participated in the machinery of repression. His execution was meant to bring closure, yet closure is never a simple thing. Inside government circles, his trial and death became a reference point for discussions on how to rebuild the justice system and manage the thousands of former fascists still embedded throughout Italian institutions. The question was not simply how to punish the guilty but how to distinguish degrees of guilt. Caruso was considered among the most culpable because of his cooperation with the Germans and his direct involvement in the events surrounding the Fosse Ardeatine massacre. But there were many others whose responsibility was less clear, whose actions were ambiguous, whose loyalties had shifted under pressure, coercion, or fear. Caruso's case, therefore, stood as an extreme example, a reminder that justice could be swift and severe when necessary, yet it also highlighted the complexities of rebuilding a nation fractured by civil conflict and foreign domination. As historians began to analyze the documents left behind from the occupation period, they traced Caruso's decisions with painstaking care. His rise within the police apparatus, his unwavering loyalty to Mussolini's regime, his close collaboration with Herbert Kappler, and his willingness to facilitate German reprisals were examined in court transcripts, surviving correspondence, and testimonies given long after his death. The picture that emerged was not of a man driven by ideology alone, nor of one coerced by overwhelming force, but rather of a bureaucrat-turned-collaborator who found purpose in authority and safety in obedience. Some scholars argued that Caruso had been a minor figure swept up by circumstances. Others insisted he was fully aware of his role and had embraced it willingly. The truth, as always, lay somewhere between these interpretations. Caruso had never been a charismatic figure. He did not command masses with speeches or inspire devotion through personal magnetism. Instead, he operated quietly within the machinery of the state, following orders, enforcing regulations, and executing policies without hesitation. This made him useful during Mussolini's early years but dangerous during the occupation. A man who never questioned authority can become a tool of atrocity when authority itself becomes criminal. In the context of wartime Rome, Caruso found himself aligned not with Italy's interests but with the oppressive demands of Nazi Germany. It was this transition, from a functionary of the fascist state to a facilitator of German terror, that sealed his fate. During the investigation that preceded his trial, a number of surviving police officers testified about Caruso's behavior in the months leading up to the Via Rasella attack. One officer recalled how Caruso seemed increasingly rigid, even nervous, as German pressure intensified. Another described him as eager to demonstrate loyalty to Kappler, perhaps out of fear of being perceived as insufficiently committed to the new order. There were accounts of heated exchanges between Caruso and his subordinates, particularly when they hesitated to carry out harsh directives. He demanded absolute obedience, claiming the situation required firm action and that Rome's security depended on unwavering discipline. In hindsight, these testimonies painted a portrait of a man who was not simply following orders but internalizing them, projecting his own anxieties onto those around him, and reinforcing the very culture of fear that allowed atrocities to occur. Some historians speculated that Caruso's psychological collapse began long before his arrest. The pressure of maintaining order in a city filled with resistance fighters, the stress of collaborating with an occupying force, and the moral weight, perhaps unacknowledged, of the violence he helped perpetrate likely eroded his composure. By the time Rome was liberated, he may have already been emotionally fractured, aware that everything he had built his identity upon was crumbling. The trial only accelerated that decline. Witnesses noted his pallor, his trembling hands, his quiet demeanor. Gone was the authoritative police chief, In his place was a man confronting the consequences of his choices. The trial itself became a symbol of Italy's transition. It was conducted swiftly but not chaotically. The judges wore simple uniforms, not the elaborate fascist regalia that had once filled courtrooms. The courtroom was crowded with journalists, officials, and civilians, all of whom listened attentively as charges were read and evidence presented. Survivors of arrests Caruso had ordered recounted their experiences: the sudden knocks on doors late at night, the beatings during interrogations, the arbitrary confiscation of property, the terror of being transported to prisons where the fate of detainees depended on whim rather than law. Some testified with voices shaking from emotion, others spoke coldly, as if reciting events to prevent themselves from breaking down. Their stories were threads in a much larger tapestry, a tapestry woven from suffering, silence, and resilience. Caruso's defense attempted to argue that he had been forced to comply with German authorities. They presented him as a man caught between two powers, a functionary who lacked real autonomy. They insisted he had been merely a clerk, a conduit through which orders passed. But the prosecution countered with documents signed by Caruso himself, showing his active involvement. Lists of detainees bore his handwriting. Interrogation orders included his personal annotations. And the selection of victims for the Fosse Ardeatine massacre, while directed by Kapler, required Caruso's intimate knowledge of the prisoners and his willingness to put names forward. No amount of legal argumentation could erase the printed forms, the signatures, or the corroborating testimonies. When the verdict was announced, silence fell over the courtroom. Death by firing squad. Some spectators nodded, others wept, and a few applauded. Caruso stood motionless, his eyes fixed somewhere in the distance, as if seeing beyond the walls around him. The guards led him away, and though he did not physically resist, his shoulders sagged under the invisible weight of a life defined by loyalty to a regime that had vanished, leaving only its crimes behind. During the final days of his life, the psychological transformation he underwent was profound. For the first time in decades, he no longer issued commands, he received them. He no longer sat behind a desk bearing his insignia, he sat alone in a cold cell, confronted by memories he could no longer dismiss. Some believed he was haunted by the faces of those whose arrests he had ordered. Others thought he was tormented by the realization that history would not remember him as a protector of order but as a collaborator in violence. In the rare moments when he spoke to guards, he asked questions tinged not with defiance but with confusion. Why had things unfolded as they had? Did his actions truly matter in the grand scheme of the war? Could he have acted differently? These were the questions of a man grappling with responsibility for the first time. But responsibility, once acknowledged or even sensed, becomes a heavy burden. His sudden introspection came too late to alter the course of events. In the days after his execution, as newspapers summarized his life in stark terms, a curious phenomenon occurred. People who had known Caruso during his early years reached out to journalists and historians to offer their recollections. Some spoke of him as a courteous young man, ambitious but respectful. Others described him as distant and withdrawn. None painted a portrait of someone destined for cruelty, and yet cruelty had defined his final role. These testimonies raised deeper questions about the nature of collaboration, obedience, and the human capacity for moral deterioration. How does an ordinary man become complicit in extraordinary evil? How does a bureaucrat evolve into an enforcer of terror? The examination of Caruso's career offered glimpses into these questions. His rise within the fascist police was slow but steady, built on reliability rather than brilliance. He had never been tasked with grand ideological projects. Instead, he enforced discipline, collected intelligence, and maintained order. When Italy allied with Nazi Germany, his role did not change immediately, but the expectations placed upon him did. The regime hardened, the oppression deepened, and Caruso adapted accordingly. At each stage, he stepped into the role required of him, never resisting, never questioning. And when Rome fell under German occupation, he stepped again into a new role, this time as a direct collaborator with the Gestapo. What made Caruso particularly dangerous was not cunning or malice but obedience. He became a conduit through which German demands flowed into the Italian population. His loyalty to the structure of authority overrode any moral intuition. Whether out of fear, ambition, or inertia, he continued to serve long after the state he had once sworn allegiance to had transformed into something monstrous. By the time he realized the full extent of what he was part of, it was too late to step back. The decisions had been made, the orders carried out, the victims buried in sealed caves. Rome's citizens, in reflecting on his execution, saw it not only as justice but as a lesson. The dangers of absolute obedience, of blind loyalty to power, and of the moral vacuum created by authoritarian systems were suddenly visible in human form. Caruso became a symbol, not of extraordinary villainy but of ordinary complicity, the kind that enables regimes to commit atrocities through the hands of men who believe they are simply doing their jobs. In the months following Pietro Caruso's execution, the memory of his life and actions did not fade from public consciousness. Instead, it became part of a broader national conversation about justice, complicity, and the reconstruction of Italian identity after the collapse of fascism. The country faced the daunting task of rebuilding its institutions while disentangling itself from 2 decades of authoritarian rule. As liberation swept through Italian cities, people began to confront the realities of a regime that had shaped their lives in ways both subtle and brutal. Figures like Caruso, who had been instruments of state authority, served as stark reminders of what had been permitted, encouraged, and rewarded under fascist governance. Rome, as the capital, became the epicenter of this reflection. Citizens who had lived under German occupation walked past the ruins of bombed buildings and the scars left by military conflict, but they also carried deeper wounds, emotional and psychological, that were not easily visible. The Fosse Ardeatine massacre, with its brutality and scale, left a stain on the city's memory. The knowledge that Italian officials had assisted in selecting the victims, including Caruso himself, forced many to acknowledge that the atrocities of the occupation were not solely the work of foreign invaders. Italians had collaborated, willingly or reluctantly, and the moral implications of this realization rippled through society. Caruso's trial and punishment played a role in how Italians processed this uncomfortable truth. In the aftermath, newspapers published detailed analyses of his crimes, debates emerged in Parliament about the nature of collaboration, and civic groups organized forums to discuss accountability. The newly reconstituted Italian government, eager to distance itself from the fascist past, used cases like Caruso's to set legal precedents. The High Court for Sanctions Against Fascism handled numerous cases of former officials, though few were as high-profile or as symbolically charged as Caruso's. His execution demonstrated that Italy intended to reclaim its sovereignty by holding its own citizens accountable rather than relying solely on allied military courts. This was crucial, not only for national pride but for establishing the legitimacy of Italy's new democratic institutions. However, justice in a post-war context is rarely neat, and Caruso's case underscored the tension between retribution and reconciliation. Some believed more executions were necessary to purge fascism from public life. Others feared that excessive punishment risked fostering resentment and hindering national unity. In historical circles, scholars revisited Caruso's life in an attempt to understand the steps that had led him to become a collaborator of German repression. They traced his trajectory through decades of service in the fascist police force, analyzing archival records, personal correspondence, and testimonies from colleagues. What emerged was not the portrait of a sadistic ideologue but of a man shaped by the structure he served. His loyalty to authority, his bureaucratic discipline, and his reluctance to question directives created a profile that was as unsettling as it was familiar. Many realized that Caruso was not unique. He was emblematic of a broader phenomenon within authoritarian regimes, the ordinary individual who becomes an instrument of extraordinary cruelty. Yet understanding Caruso's motivations did not equate to excusing his actions. Rather, it highlighted the necessity of examining the social, political, and institutional conditions that allow such transformations to occur. The Italian resistance, composed of individuals who had chosen a different path, argued that obedience did not absolve moral responsibility. They pointed to Caruso's willingness to collaborate with Kappler and his meticulous execution of German orders as proof that he had agency, even if he chose to suppress it. His final months, marked by isolation and resignation, seemed to confirm that he recognized, however belatedly, the weight of his choices. While scholars debated Caruso's psychology, ordinary citizens carried on with the daily struggles of rebuilding their lives. Food shortages persisted, political tension simmered, and questions about the future of the monarchy loomed large. The sense of collective trauma made it difficult for many to think deeply about individuals like Caruso beyond seeing him as a symbol of a dark chapter. However, his name occasionally surfaced in conversations about justice, reminding people that accountability had begun, even if imperfectly. Among survivors and families of victims, the execution brought a complex mixture of emotions. For some, it was a moment of vindication. For others, it reopened wounds that had not yet begun to heal. In the homes of those who had lost loved ones during the occupation, Caruso's death was not seen as closure but as a single moment in a long journey of grief. They wondered what he had felt in his final hours, whether he had understood the suffering he caused, and whether he had expressed remorse privately even if not publicly. The lack of surviving personal writings from Caruso left these questions unanswered, creating a void that would never be fully satisfied. At the same time, Caruso's execution had a profound effect on former fascist officials who were still awaiting trial. Some attempted to distinguish their actions from his, arguing they had been less directly involved in atrocities. Others feared they might meet the same fate if public sentiment demanded harsh punishments. This fear prompted some to cooperate with investigators, offering testimonies about the inner workings of the fascist police and their collaboration with German forces. The information they provided helped historians and authorities construct a more complete picture of the occupation period. Caruso's case also influenced international observers, particularly within the Allied forces overseeing Italy's transition. They viewed his execution as evidence that Italy was capable of handling its own internal reckoning. This allowed Allied authorities to focus more on broader strategic concerns and less on micromanaging Italian judicial processes. Britain and the United States, in particular, were aware that Italy needed to restore its autonomy in order to rebuild political stability. Caruso's case demonstrated that the Italian legal system could function even amid the chaos of war and reconstruction. In German circles, particularly among former SS members who had served in Rome, Caruso's execution was met with a mix of disdain and self-preserving silence. They considered him a collaborator but not one of their own. Kappler, who had worked closely with Caruso, was captured later and tried by an Italian military tribunal. His trial, longer and more complex, brought renewed attention to Caruso's role, reinforcing the perception that the two men had been partners in repression, even if their ranks and nationalities differed. Kappler's case further cemented Caruso's historical reputation as a key Italian collaborator, not simply a figure who had been swept up in events. Years later, as Italy entered a period of economic recovery and political stabilization, the memory of Caruso remained alive in certain circles but faded from public consciousness. School curricula highlighted the Fosse Ardeatine massacre, resistance activities, and the fall of fascism, but they often mentioned Caruso only briefly. He became a footnote in the larger narrative of liberation and national rebirth. Historians, however, continued to study him, recognizing that his story offered valuable lessons about moral responsibility, the dangers of authoritarian systems, and the fragility of human judgment. Archival research uncovered new details about his early life, his personality, and his administrative style. Some records revealed his meticulous attention to paperwork, his insistence on proper procedure, and his belief in the necessity of order. Others documented his increasingly authoritarian behavior during the occupation, his willingness to punish subordinates who showed hesitation, and his efforts to present himself as indispensable to the Germans. These sources painted a multifaceted portrait, showing how ordinary traits, discipline, loyalty, ambition, could evolve into instruments of oppression under the wrong conditions. The psychological dimension of Caruso's transformation became a topic of academic interest. Scholars examined the factors that could lead a man like him to become complicit in atrocities. They considered the influence of authoritarian culture, the pressure of hierarchical structures, the appeal of belonging to a powerful institution, and the gradual erosion of moral boundaries in the face of political necessity. Caruso's life illustrated how totalitarian regimes rely not only on leaders and ideologues but on countless administrators who keep the system functioning through routine tasks and unquestioning obedience. Some scholars argued that Caruso had been trapped by circumstances. Others insisted that he had chosen his path deliberately, seeking to protect his position and authority even at the cost of human lives. The truth likely lay somewhere in the intersection of these interpretations. The complexity of his decisions did not absolve him, but it underscored the difficulty of defining guilt in absolute terms. His trial had addressed legal guilt, but moral guilt remained a subject of ongoing debate. Families who had suffered under the occupation continued to grapple with their memories. Caruso's execution provided a point of reference, a moment they could hold on to in their quest for meaning amid tragedy. Yet many felt that justice, while necessary, could never be complete. The wounds left by the occupation were not easily healed, and the knowledge that Italian officials had aided the Germans added an additional layer of sorrow. These families passed down their stories to younger generations, ensuring that the memory of both the victims and the perpetrators would not be forgotten. By the time Italy entered the economic boom of the 1950s and 1960s, the nation's focus had shifted toward modernization and rebuilding. New highways, factories, and cultural movements emerged, overshadowing the painful memories of the war years. But in the shadows of modern Rome, among the ruins, monuments, and memorials, the legacy of the occupation remained visible to those who looked closely. The Fosse Ardeatine Memorial, in particular, became a site of reflection, where visitors contemplated the names of the victims and the events that had led to their deaths. Caruso's name was not engraved among the fallen, nor would it ever be. His legacy remained that of a man whose choices contributed to one of the darkest episodes in Italian history. Yet understanding his role allowed Italy to confront a difficult truth, that the path to justice requires not only remembering the victims but also acknowledging the perpetrators, not to honor them, but to ensure that their actions are studied, understood, and never repeated. As the years passed and the immediate urgency of post-war justice subsided, the figure of Pietro Caruso gradually receded from public attention. Italy entered a new era, one defined by reconstruction, political transformation, and the bitter divisions of the Cold War. People began to focus on rebuilding their homes, securing employment, and navigating the shifting political landscape that would soon give rise to the First Republic. Yet even as daily life resumed and the economy slowly revived, the shadow of the fascist past remained, surfacing in debates, trials, and the collective memory of a populace that had lived through dictatorship, occupation, and civil conflict. Caruso's actions, recorded in court documents and wartime archives, remained part of the national record. His execution had been swift and public, but the implications of his choices continued to resonate. Scholars revisited his life from multiple perspectives, attempting to understand how a seemingly ordinary police official had become complicit in some of the most brutal acts committed during the German occupation of Rome. His name appeared in academic works, footnotes, and analyses of fascist collaboration, always in the context of the Fosse Ardeatine massacre, a tragedy that had become emblematic of the cruelty inflicted upon Italy during the war. As the Fosse Ardeatine Memorial gained prominence, attracting visitors from across the country and beyond, Caruso's role in the selection of victims was frequently mentioned in speeches, ceremonies, and school curricula. Students learned the names of the 335 individuals executed in the cave, many of whom had been chosen from Caruso's own lists. Their stories were documented in detail: fathers, sons, political prisoners, intellectuals, workers, Jews taken from the Regina Coeli prison. Each year, wreaths were laid, families gathered to remember their lost loved ones, and political leaders reaffirmed their commitment to democracy and freedom. In these moments of remembrance, Caruso's actions were recalled not as a central narrative but as an essential part of understanding how such a massacre could occur. Historians studying fascist-era bureaucracy found Caruso's career illustrative of a larger pattern. Many fascist officials had risen through the ranks not because of ideological devotion but because of their reliability, obedience, and willingness to enforce orders. Caruso embodied this pattern with unsettling precision. His early service was unremarkable, but as the regime demanded greater repression, he adapted without hesitation. His transformation from a disciplined administrator to an instrument of German terror revealed the dangerous fluidity of roles within authoritarian systems. Scholars pointed out that totalitarian regimes rely not only on ideological fanaticism but also on the compliance of ordinary individuals, who become functionaries of violence through routine acts of obedience. This realization prompted broader reflections on moral responsibility. Caruso was not a mastermind of genocide, nor a high-ranking Nazi official. He did not design policies of extermination or organize large-scale deportations. Yet his actions enabled atrocities. His position as police chief of Rome placed him at a crossroads where he could have mitigated the impact of German orders, or amplified them. He chose the latter. The recognition that a single administrator could influence the fate of hundreds of lives forced Italian society to confront the moral complexities of collaboration. Responsibility did not lie only with those who gave the orders but also with those who executed them, those who filed the paperwork, those who arranged the transport, those who created the administrative infrastructure that allowed terror to operate efficiently. Among the families of the victims, memories of Caruso remained vivid. For them, his execution was not merely a legal outcome but a symbolic act, a confirmation that the state acknowledged the injustice suffered by their loved ones. Yet many expressed frustration that justice had been incomplete. While Caruso and a small number of others were punished, countless collaborators returned quietly to civilian life. Some found new roles in the post-war government, others blended into society without ever facing trial. For these families, Caruso was both a symbol of justice achieved and a reminder of justice denied. In the private sphere, Caruso's own family carried the burden of his legacy. They faced public scrutiny, social ostracism, and the weight of his name. While records of their lives remain sparse, some accounts suggest they struggled in the years following his execution, caught between loyalty to a loved one and the public condemnation of his actions. They were forced to reconcile personal memories of a father or husband with the historical reality of a man who had facilitated a massacre. The emotional toll of such a legacy is often overlooked in historical narratives, yet it forms an integral part of understanding the human dimension of justice, guilt, and remembrance. By the 1970s, Italy experienced a resurgence of interest in the wartime period, known as the Memory Wars. Political movements on both the left and right sought to reinterpret the legacy of fascism and the resistance. Some attempted to downplay the severity of fascist crimes or to portray certain collaborators as victims of circumstance. Others pushed back, emphasizing the importance of acknowledging Italy's complicity in wartime atrocities. In this environment, Caruso's case resurfaced in public debate. His collaboration with the Germans, his administrative role in the Fosse Ardeatine massacre, and his execution were revisited in newspapers and academic journals. His name became a reference point in arguments about whether individual guilt could be separated from systemic oppression. Yet despite these debates, Caruso never became a figure of political rehabilitation. Unlike some lesser-known fascist officials, his actions were too closely tied to a singular atrocity of overwhelming magnitude. The Fosse Ardeatine massacre was not a battlefield tragedy or an ambiguous wartime incident. It was a deliberate execution of civilians carried out as a reprisal, and Caruso had played an undeniable role in making it possible. No political movement, no matter how revisionist, could fully detach him from that legacy. Even among those who sought to reframe aspects of fascist history, Caruso remained a symbol of moral collapse. By the 1990s, with the opening of previously restricted archives and the expansion of Holocaust studies in Italy, a younger generation of historians revisited the occupation period with fresh perspectives. They analyzed the role of Italian institutions in the persecution of Jews, the suppression of resistance movements, and the enforcement of German directives. Caruso's actions were placed within this larger context, revealing the interconnectedness of Italian and German security apparatuses. New documents confirmed his active collaboration with Kappler and his personal involvement in the administrative logistics of the massacre. While these findings did not alter the broad understanding of his guilt, they provided greater detail about how the machinery of repression functioned. This renewed scholarship influenced public memory. It highlighted the importance of studying not only the overt violence of fascism but also the administrative mechanisms that supported it. Caruso's signature on lists, his orders recorded in official registers, and his participation in the selection of victims served as tangible reminders that atrocities require more than ideology, they require organization, documentation, and human participation at multiple levels. His role demonstrated how evil can manifest not only in dramatic acts but in paperwork, meetings, and bureaucratic decisions. As Italy entered the 21st century, public commemorations of the Fosse Ardeatine massacre remained solemn and well attended. Each year, political leaders issued statements reaffirming the nation's commitment to democracy and rejecting totalitarianism in all its forms. Caruso's name appeared occasionally in historical references, always in connection with the tragedy. For most Italians, he became a distant figure, known primarily to those who studied the war years or visited the memorial. Yet his legacy persisted as part of Italy's collective memory, a reminder of the dangers that arise when individuals surrender their moral judgment to authoritarian systems. The lessons drawn from Caruso's life extended beyond his own time. His transformation from a disciplined bureaucrat to a collaborator in Nazi terror became a case study in the psychology of obedience and the fragility of ethical boundaries under pressure. Scholars, teachers, and legal experts used his example to illustrate how ordinary individuals can become complicit in extraordinary crimes, not through monstrous intentions, but through conformity, ambition, fear, or passive acceptance of authority. His story also resonated with efforts to understand the mechanics of state violence in other contexts. Comparisons were drawn between Caruso and officials in various authoritarian regimes around the world. His life served as a reminder that oppressive systems rely on the cooperation of many, not just the leadership. It demonstrated that the boundary between civilian administration and criminal activity can dissolve when a state demands absolute obedience. Through this lens, Caruso became not just a historical figure but a cautionary example for contemporary societies grappling with questions of democratic resilience, human rights, and institutional accountability. In Rome, traces of Caruso's life remain in the places he once governed, the streets where arrests were made, the police headquarters where he issued orders, the prison where detainees awaited uncertain fates. But the city has transformed in ways he could never have imagined. It stands today as a symbol of resilience, its monuments a testament to centuries of history, its people living in the freedoms that he, through his service to an oppressive regime, once helped deny. His grave, unmarked and largely forgotten, holds no flowers, no tributes, no quiet visitors seeking solace. It is a lonely resting place for a man whose legacy is one of harm and betrayal. Yet his memory endures, not as a figure to be celebrated, but as one to be studied, understood, and remembered for the role he played in a tragedy that shaped Italy's modern identity. The lessons drawn from his life are painful but essential. They remind us that justice must be vigilant, that authority must be questioned, and that democracy requires the courage to confront both the past and the present with honesty. In the end, Pietro Caruso's story is not merely the tale of a single man's downfall. It is a reflection of a nation's confrontation with its darkest hours, a testament to the power of memory, and a warning about the choices individuals make when placed at the intersection of power and morality. His final moments, marked by fear, silence, and inevitability, closed the chapter of his life, but the consequences of his actions echo still, woven into the collective history of Italy and serving as a reminder of the profound responsibility each person bears in shaping the world around them.